Chapter 15. Legal Safety versus Moral Clarity. By the time Kristen Cabot woke up on the morning after the Coldplay concert, she already knew she needed help. Not emotional help, though she needed that too. Professional help. The specific kind provided by people who understand how stories move through media systems and how to influence that movement. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I was not equipped to make the safest or most informed decisions about how to respond to the wildfire that had erupted in the media overnight, she would later say. She hired Deanie von Mueffling, founder and CEO of Deanie von Mueffling Communications, a New York-based public relations firm. Von Mueffling began working with Cabot immediately, on strategy, on positioning, on the decision of when to speak, to whom, and in what form. The relationship lasted through the Times interview in December, through the Oprah podcast in March, and, as von Mueffling told Campaign US when the Times piece broke, was not finished. "You've definitely not seen the last of Kristen Cabot," she said. Von Mueffling described her work with Cabot as covering general counsel, perspective, media relations, and strategy. Her stated goal for Cabot was to help her regain her stellar reputation of an in-demand executive. The crisis communication strategy, as von Mueffling articulated it publicly, was built around the principle that going silent frequently makes the problem worse, and that opening the lines of communication to the media is really important. This is the unseen presence at the center of this chapter, not on the stage, not in the frame, but shaping, from its first word to its last, what both interviews said, what they emphasized, what they approached carefully, and what they did not approach at all. The infrastructure of the account. Understanding the infrastructure behind the Cabot interviews is not a matter of cynicism. It is a matter of accuracy. In any high-stakes public accountability situation involving a private individual, the presence of professional communication support is standard practice and entirely legitimate. People who are navigating genuine crises, who have been genuinely harmed by disproportionate public responses, who have genuine legal exposure, who have genuine reputational interests, are entitled to professional guidance in how they communicate. The presence of a communications consultant does not make an interview dishonest. It makes it strategic, but it does make it something. And what it makes it, a strategically constructed, professionally managed, legally informed public account, is different from what it presents as a personal, reflective, emotionally honest telling of what happened and what it meant. The gap between those two things is not dishonesty. It is the specific structural gap between a communication that has been optimized for a defined outcome and a communication that is simply attempting to tell the truth. Crisis communications as a discipline is built on a clear premise that the way information is presented shapes how it is received, and that shaping information presentation in service of a client's interests is a legitimate professional function. Von Mueffling's stated goal, regaining Cabot's stellar reputation as an in-demand executive, is a professional outcome. It is not the same goal as achieving moral clarity about what happened and what it cost the people most affected by it. These goals are not incompatible, but they are not identical. And when they diverge, the professional infrastructure built around the communications goal will serve that goal rather than the other one. This is the unseen influence, not a conspiracy, not a deception. A structural feature of how public accountability narratives are produced in the contemporary media environment. One that shapes what can be said, what is emphasized, what is carefully avoided, and what is left to sit in the silence that the strategic account creates around it. What cannot be said. there is always a version of the truth that can be told safely, and there is always another version that carries consequence. Understanding the relationship between these two versions and what happens when they diverge is the central question of this chapter. Legal exposure in a situation like Cabot's is real and multifaceted. Any direct acknowledgement that Byron's marriage was not as he represented it, that his wife was not aware of a separation, that she may have been operating under a false understanding of her own marriage while her husband was developing an attachment to someone else, potentially creates legal exposure for multiple parties. Any direct statement that Byron engaged in deliberate deception directed at Cabot could support a claim against him. Any acknowledgement by Cabot of specific harms caused to Megan Kerrigan, Byron could, in a litigious context, be read as an admission relevant to claims Megan Byron might choose to bring. This is why Cabot's formulation in the Oprah interview was so carefully crafted. I want to be really careful because the world spoke for me and on my behalf, and I don't want to do that to somebody else in their family. I don't feel comfortable. But I will say a lot of what was represented to me was not true. The care is visible. The sentence is architecturally precise. It implies a great deal. It states almost nothing that could be used as a legal admission. It is the product of considerable professional and legal thought. Similarly, Cabot's framing of her own choices, I made a bad decision and had a couple of high noons and danced and acted inappropriately with my boss, is carefully bounded. It acknowledges a mistake in the moment of the concert. It does not acknowledge the months of developing relationship that preceded the concert. It does not acknowledge the specific professional context, the CEO and his HR chief, the reporting relationship, the power dynamic, in terms that would create a record of professional boundary violations. It stays precisely within the perimeter of what can be acknowledged without opening new fronts. None of this is dishonest. Every word is technically accurate. But technical accuracy and moral clarity are not the same thing. And the cumulative effect of a narrative in which every statement has been filtered through the question of what can be said safely, rather than the question of what needs to be said fully, is a narrative that protects rather than reveals, however genuine the underlying feelings, however real the suffering that is described within it. The sound of protective language. Protective language has a sound. Once you learn to hear it, you cannot unhear it. It is precise where it should be simple. It hedges where clarity is available. It uses the passive voice where agency exists. It moves through a series of technically accurate statements in a sequence that produces an impression of openness, of honesty, of full disclosure, that the individual statements do not quite deliver on their own. Consider the phrase, I took accountability and I gave up my career for that. The sentence moves from accountability to consequence with a speed that collapses the two. Accountability is demonstrated by the price paid. This is grammatically clean and emotionally resonant. But accountability, properly understood, is not a price paid. It is an acknowledgement made to the person harmed. The conflation, the substitution of personal consequence for acknowledgement of impact, is subtle enough to pass in ordinary listening and precise enough to have been constructed deliberately. Consider, I own the poor decision that I made in that moment. The phrase, in that moment, is doing specific work. It bounds the accountability to the concert, to the 15 seconds on the Jumbotron, or at most to the evening of July 16th. The poor decision made in that moment is not the same as the choices I made in the months that preceded that moment. One is contained, the other is open. One requires a specific bounded acknowledgement. The other would require examining the full arc of what developed and what it produced for the people living inside the primary relationship that was being, in the months before the concert, quietly renegotiated without their knowledge. Consider the careful framing around Byron's alleged deception. A lot of what was represented to me was not true. This phrase implies that Byron misrepresented the situation without stating it as fact. It allows the implication to land that Cabot was deceived without creating a factual record that Byron could specifically dispute or that could generate legal consequence. The implication does its work, the legal exposure is managed, and the fuller story of what the misrepresentation meant for the person who did not have access to any version of the truth remains, as it has throughout, unaddressed. The PR Week conference and the gap it reveals. In April 2026, Kristen Cabot is scheduled to headline the PR Week Crisis Communications Conference. Her topic, Taking Back the Narrative. Tickets are priced at $875 per person. This detail is not offered as mockery. It is offered as data. Because the gap between taking back the narrative as a professional communications goal and telling the full truth as a moral goal is precisely the gap this chapter has been examining. And the fact that the interviews that this book has been analyzing for 8 chapters were produced by the same strategic infrastructure that generates a PR Week speaking engagement, that the account of what happened is also, from the beginning, the professional case study, is not incidental to how the account was shaped. Von Mueffling's stated goal was to regain Cabot's stellar reputation as an in-demand executive. The PR Week speaking slot at $875 a ticket is the measure of how well that goal has been achieved. Cabot has, by professional communications metrics, done something remarkable. She has converted a viral scandal into a professional platform. She has turned the experience of being the most watched person of 2025 into a career in speaking about what it means to survive that experience. The communication strategy has worked. But there is a question that the professional success of the strategy leaves open, and it is the question this book has been asking since its introduction. The communications goal and the moral goal are not the same goal. The account that served one served it extremely well. The account that would have served the other, that would have offered the direct, named, other-directed acknowledgement that genuine accountability requires, was not produced, because it would not have served the professional goal, because the infrastructure that generated the interviews was built to serve the professional goal, and the moral goal, which would have required a different kind of courage and a different kind of sacrifice, was the one that went unserved. When sincerity exists within constraint. This chapter must be careful about one thing. The presence of professional infrastructure and legal caution does not mean the absence of genuine feeling. The two can coexist. A person can be simultaneously sincere in their emotional experience and managed in their public presentation of that experience. The feelings the Cabot interviews communicated were real. The fear was real. The suffering was real. The embarrassment and the horror and the specific grief of having one's professional identity dissolved overnight. All of it was real, and none of it was performed in the cynical sense of being fabricated. But sincerity of feeling is not the same as completeness of account. And the specific test, the one this book has been applying since Chapter 12's careful counting of the word sorry, is not whether the feelings were genuine. It is whether the account was complete, whether the frame expanded beyond the self, whether the person most directly harmed was named, acknowledged, and addressed in a way that would have been felt as acknowledgement. The Crisis Communications Analysis published in December 2025, reviewing the Times interview, made an observation that is relevant here. The journalist noted Cabot's repeated return to a list of talking points prepared with a PR specialist. The talking points were visible, the preparation was visible, and the visibility of the preparation is itself a form of evidence. It tells us that the account was constructed rather than simply offered, shaped rather than simply shared. This is not a condemnation. It is a description of a mode of public communication that has its own integrity, the integrity of a professionally managed account. But that is a different mode from the unguarded, unmanaged, other-directed communication that genuine remorse requires. Sincerity existed within constraint. The question is what the constraint prevented, and what it prevented consistently, directionally, in service of a clearly defined professional goal was the acknowledgement this book has been asking for since its first page. We may never know the whole. There is an intellectual honesty that this chapter owes to its reader, and it requires naming something that the analysis so far has perhaps implied without stating directly. We may never know the full shape of what could not be said. The legal considerations that shaped the Cabot interviews are, by definition, not public. The specific legal advice given, the specific exposures identified, the specific statements that were considered and set aside, none of this is documented in any accessible record. This book has inferred the presence of legal shaping from the observable characteristics of the language, its precision, its hedging, its careful passive constructions, its bounded acknowledgments. But inference is not proof. It is the most reasonable reading of the evidence. It may not be the complete story. It is possible that the absence of a direct acknowledgement of Megan Kerrigan Byron was not primarily the result of legal advice. It is possible that it was the result of genuine consideration for Megan's stated preference for privacy, a reluctance, as Cabot said in the Oprah interview, to speak for someone else's experience when she herself had found that experience intolerable. That explanation has a genuine coherence. It cannot be dismissed. What this book can say, what it has been documenting carefully across 4 chapters, is that the effect is the same regardless of the cause. Whether the absence of acknowledgement is the result of legal caution, genuine consideration for privacy, narrative management, or simple emotional incapacity to expand the frame beyond the self, the person who most needed to be acknowledged has not been acknowledged. Megan Kerrigan Byron has not received in any public context a direct and named expression of remorse from the person who played a role in the choices that most directly affected her. That is the fact. The cause of the fact remains in some measure uncertain, and the uncertainty itself tells us something, because a genuine commitment to moral clarity, the kind that operates independently of legal safety, professional strategy, and narrative management, tends not to produce the kind of uncertainty this chapter describes. It tends to produce the kind of statement that is unmistakable in its direction and undeniable in its intent. The fact that uncertainty remains about whether the absence of acknowledgement was legally advised or strategically chosen or genuinely considered is itself evidence that the acknowledgement was never the primary thing being optimized for. If it had been, it would have arrived, the way genuine things, when they are the primary thing, tend to arrive. The standard beyond safety. This chapter is not asking Cabot to have placed herself at unlimited legal and professional risk in the name of moral clarity. That is not a realistic standard, and it is not the standard being applied here. People navigating genuine legal exposure are entitled to navigate it carefully. People who have been harassed, threatened, and had their home address broadcast on radio are entitled to the protection that professional communications support provides. The infrastructure was legitimate. The caution was understandable. What this chapter is asking is something different. It is asking whether, within the very considerable latitude that the communications infrastructure provided, within the platform of an hour-long Oprah interview with full communication support, 8 months after the event, with the legal situation having had time to clarify, the decision was made to pursue the communications goal rather than the moral one. Whether the account that was produced was optimized, consistently, and in a single direction for the professional goal of narrative rehabilitation rather than for the moral goal of genuine acknowledgement. The evidence this book has assembled suggests that it was. The account was complete enough to be emotionally compelling. It was not complete enough to name the person most harmed. It was careful enough to avoid legal exposure. It was not direct enough to offer genuine remorse. It was structured enough to serve the speaking circuit. It was not unguarded enough to serve the truth. These are not binary choices. There was room within the space that communication support and legal counsel left available for more directness than was deployed. The gap between legal safety and moral clarity did not have to be as wide as the account made it. It was made that wide by choices that served one goal very well and left the other, the one this book has been asking about since its introduction, unserved. Perhaps sincerity, as your introduction observed, has a way of cutting through even the most careful restraint. But sincerity in this case did not cut through. What remained was the lingering feeling of something managed, not dishonest, not fabricated, but optimized for an outcome that was not the one the people most affected by what happened most needed, and that, the gap between what safety required and what clarity would have offered, is what this chapter names, not as condemnation, as the final piece of the architecture that this book has been mapping since its first page, the architecture of a narrative that told, but did not quite reveal,